Welcome to the Scaleup Valley podcast, where we bring the best founders and investors to help you scale your business from 1 million to 1 trillion. Today's guest is a very special one. As you know, I'm very passionate about different regions across the globe: Europe, the US, LATAM, Southeast Asia. We've been covering the best scale-ups, founders, investors across those regions. But I'm very, very passionate about LATAM and Southeast Asia. And I would not have a better guest to represent LATAM, and you would know more about his vision for the region than Brian Requarth, the co-founder of Latitud. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it should be after 240 plus episodes. I need to admit that I'm a little bit nervous today, which also shows that I've almost listened to all your podcasts. So which is kind of a praise to the great job that you are doing and the privilege to have you here. But of course, for the ones who didn't have the privilege to know more about your story, if you could quickly introduce yourself, that would be amazing.
No, thank you. So I'm an American from California. I found my way to Latin America actually on a road trip. I drove from California to Costa Rica, bought a one-way ticket to Bogota, Colombia. A lot of times there's a woman behind these stories. So my wife likes to say that she imported me to Colombia. So this was 18 years ago. I stepped off, actually, I ended up having to fly portion of that because you can't drive from Panama to Colombia. So I sold my car in Costa Rica, bought that one-way ticket and stepped off the plane, and plans to make it all the way down to Patagonia. Ended up spending, 3 months turned into 6 years in Colombia. And then like anyone that needs to kind of pay the bills, I couldn't get hired to do much. And so I kind of became an entrepreneur and I started a few different companies. First as an English teacher, that was how I paid the bills, and that wasn't my true ambition, and quickly realized that there was an incredible opportunity in real estate as I had trouble finding an apartment of my own. And I ended up launching Viva Real, which is essentially a kind of classifieds 2.0 business. I read a case study from Mercado Libre, and that kind of set off this inspiration. And so ended up building that business and eventually expanding it to Brazil, where that was the kind of the main market. And then we sold the company in 2020.
Awesome. And maybe we start that before introducing kind of Latitud and going even more deeper into what you are trying to do with Latitud. Let's take a minute there, really going from Colombia, or being an American, coming to Latin America, staying with your wife in Colombia, and then moving to Brazil. And of course, we have the typical questions: why Brazil? Why did you decide to move from Colombia to Brazil? And what has been some of your startup lessons and scaling up lessons with Viva Real, if you would need to summarize?
Yes, so I would say that after 6 years of being in Colombia, I didn't set out to I didn't have this super clear vision of I'm going to build this massive business. And it was really, this is kind of pre any venture ecosystem in the region, right? And so it started off just more as solving problems and solving a problem that I had. And then quickly, realized after I had launched the business, I got inspired by Mercado Libre, which for those that don't know is, Latin America's, most valuable tech company. And it's, they have a bunch of different businesses today, but it's kind of a mix of Amazon and eBay and PayPal and all kind of rolled up into one. And I remember reading the case study, and I was identifying that Brazil was by far their largest market. Right. And then I went and did some really simple research. I remember going to Google and I typed in our main customers, just for those that don't know the business, our main customers were real estate agencies and agents. And we basically became kind of the central marketplace where we aggregated all of the inventory and help property searchers identify the opportunities to either buy or rent real estate. And so when I did that, I went to Google and I typed in, I did a little research on the agencies, and then I kind of looked at the volume of potential customers just in the state of Rio de Janeiro, and it was more than the entire country of Colombia. And so that was kind of an opportunity. And I realized that if I wanted to build business with scale, I needed to go where there was a large enough market. And so that brought me to Brazil.
Right. Awesome. And in terms of at the time, it would be a very hard job to really raise different rounds of capital, and even having some lessons or some insights on how to scale a company. It was very rare at the time, and you were able to raise 74 million US dollars through your venture in Brazil. So how did you see the evolution, and how has been some of the challenges that you faced as an entrepreneur at the time that you don't want to see the new entrepreneurs facing again?
Yeah, we're in a much different scenario and backdrop today than compared to when I started, back in 2009. I think I went out to go raise capital 2008, 2009. And mind you, this was the backdrop of the economic crisis, where real estate was at the center, right? So the fact that it was, water in the desert, meaning capital not available, compounded with a global financial crisis where real estate was at the center, it was definitely very difficult to approach investors and identify which investors would even invest in the region. There's always a flight to safety when there's, an economic crisis like that. And so, Colombia, Brazil, these are not markets that are seen as safe havens for large pools of capital. So I would say that the lessons there, I don't think that we're ever going to experience in Latin America just the scarcity of capital that we've seen, that I saw 10, 15 years ago. So I don't think we'll ever have to revisit that. And I think that, the other challenges was just really building a team at that stage, because the attractiveness of joining a tech startup in Latin America, just the mentality of people was not the risk. It was risk averse, and there wasn't enough success cases that you could point to and be like, oh, you should do this because it's a valid career path. So everyone wanted to work in banking, in consulting, and so I'd say that was some of the difficult, and if you're building a company, you obviously need a team because you can't do it alone. And so that obviously probably compounded even more of the challenges.
Absolutely, and it makes a lot of sense because at the time there was also not a lot of scale-ups out there where you could have a kind of a second or third time executive also joining your company and knowing, okay, I already know how to go from Series A to Series B, or from Series B to Series C, or if we want to convert that into dollars or reais or whatever it is. That today we have, fortunately, and people starting specializing and helping companies to scale from one point to another, or even starting up companies and going to another company, helping the founders to go into from 0 to 1, or from 1 to 5, or 5 to 10, right? So it's a very different moment, fortunately.
It definitely is. Yeah. I mean, the environment today, if you're just lazy if you don't kind of research and read, because there's so much available content, and there's so much more available. I was fortunate to find a handful of mentors that had been part of the, ecosystem in the US, being part of, success stories. I had another person in Australia that was a really fundamental, resource for me. So it took me a while, but I did find a couple, but you're right. I didn't have a lot of local connections there. One, I just didn't know a lot of people in Brazil when I first moved there. And then two, there wasn't, kind of a ton of success stories where I could kind of latch on to someone that had already been in the trenches. And so it was kind of an early generation of companies being started at that time.
Even your co-founder, if I'm right, is a German who was also with you on an adventure in Latin America, and that's why you guys came together to build a business, also to be able to pay your bills at the time, and you started thinking about business ideas, about how you will sustain yourselves and your families at the time, right?
Yeah, the motivation was like basically pay the bills and be able to have enough money to pay rent and buy food and things like that. So yeah, it was not like an opportunistic drop out of leave my business school opportunity and like identify this white space that was, a huge opportunity. And so it was really more out of necessity rather than an opportunistic move.
And that's great also to see the ecosystem evolving in that sense. Of course, a lot of founders are still in survival mode, but we start seeing some founders that definitely now are joining entrepreneurship without the survival mode. Maybe then they will face always the ups and downs and the difficulties of building a business, and they will get back into survival mode. But that's not anymore the main motivation behind building a business. And of course, of the freedom component that every entrepreneur loves to have, and being able to define or to design our own path, our own journey, without needing to say yes to a boss all the time. And also having a different kind of leaders nowadays that give you the space, give you the ownership of being part of a venture. And we are seeing that also with the majority of the founders distributing much more equity nowadays. So the executives and the teams can also benefit from feeling part of the vision, the purpose of the company, and also being owners of that future, right? That's also another evolution of the ecosystem.
And that kicks off a virtuous cycle because, I remember the day that I got a phone call from, an early employee, and they're like, wow, I just, received the wire, and like, and then that kind of puts them in a completely different, place in their life where they can afford to take a risk. And they, were part of a growth story. And so they gave them not only the capital, but the skills and know-how to be able to, apply that to something else. So I think that that's something really positive that, historically maybe wasn't very common in Latin America. And nowadays, most companies I know, they're, pretty generous on the equity, and that kicks off a virtuous cycle of,
right,
great companies being built, and then people reinvesting the capital that they made into their own, ventures.
Right. So you would kind of summarizing kind of course, fundraising at the time was hard. There was not a lot of capital available, especially in Latin America. Kind of building the team for each stage of growth was not also easy. You're, of course, fortunate to find a great co-founder with similar motivations as yours in terms of the founding team, but then transitioning into the leadership team. And I assume also going through that economic downturn that we are kind of seeing something, I would say not similar yet, but a perfect storm that is coming on our ways today, and especially in a bubble that happened in real estate at the time that allowed you to build a huge muscle in terms of resilience to be able to make your company successful over the years. And something really jumping, because I would like to cover more Latitude and what comes, what are your dreams and what are you doing to build a different future for everyone based on your experience with Viva Real and being an entrepreneur yourself. You have an amazing reputation as an angel. So everybody says that you are there for entrepreneurs, also because you emphasize with them, given the issues that you have faced, and you have been close also to, you said almost $24 or something like that in the bank account at a certain time, right?
$87, yeah.
87. Okay, I was even going a little bit more dramatic, 24, but 87 or 24.
In the context that you gave, there's no difference between 24 and 87. It's
exactly
maybe an extra couple meals, but that's you can't really build a company with that.
But yeah, and anyway, you have been involved in more than 80 plus investments as an angel. When did you start investing? Because I think that this is critical as an ecosystem, that the founders of the previous generation are able to, of course, set up to build their new ventures, as you are doing with Latitude, but also reinvesting in the ecosystem as angels and supporting others with their experience as operators in the past, and in your case, still in the present. What has been some of your lessons learned also as an angel with this second act, not only as an entrepreneur, as a founder, but also as an angel, helping other founders?
The way I got into angel investing was pretty simple. Like I had some degree of success at the time. I started scaling the company. I attracted some, higher profile investors, and we were seeing some really good traction in the business. And so by default, that attracts entrepreneurs that are looking to build something, right? And so if I was a little further along and 2 or 3 steps ahead, I would get a lot of inbound interest from founders that would basically question, hey, how did you end up raising your Series B round, for example? Like, what was that like? I've kind of found product market fit. I'm starting to scale the business. I need some additional fuel to grow the business. And so I ended up just having a lot of conversations and giving advice to founders, because I found myself very empathetic, as you said, because I remember striking out so many times with investors because there wasn't much of an ecosystem. So I remember the pain of getting rejected. I remember the, kind of just aimless message that I would send on LinkedIn to try to attract an investor and then get, 0 responses. And I didn't have a network of people that I, could lean on, because I didn't go to a top school, or I didn't come from a Google or a Facebook or, fill in the blank. And so I really had to just kind of, just scrap to get to, to build those relationships. And so when I get a cold message from someone, or, someone that, would literally just write like a relatively, thoughtful message that say, hey, I really like what you're doing at Viva Real. I think you're building a really interesting culture from what I've seen on the outside. And it looks like you've had some success raising capital. I am at this stage where I'm trying to raise capital. I pretty much would respond to 100% of the messages, right? Just because I identified. And so what I didn't realize was basically deal flow, right? Like, I was just getting deal flow. And I would say that there's, either 1 degree of separation or immediate connection, or even a couple degrees of separation where someone would just randomly message me. But, you end up building a network of friends and people that are, also in tech. And probably as an angel investor, if you're a successful founder, you're surrounded by other amazing entrepreneurs. I actually regret and think back to I remember seeing incredible stories early on, before they were big, but I was so focused on my own thing that I just was like, yeah, I don't have time for that. Or I saw it as a distraction, when the reality is that putting a check in another company is not a distraction. You can be realistic with the time that you'll spend with them, but it's an opportunity to learn also. The secret to angel, the little, kind of secret about angel investing is that, you're helping someone, you're supporting them with capital and some advice sometimes, but it's a great opportunity to learn. You can see, very close up, and a lot of the innovative ideas. I remember talking to David Velez from Nubank before he even launched Nubank. And he was like, hey, I'm going to build a bank. I could have learned a ton of things about the get member strategy they had, and the kind of, early growth strategy. And so those are all things that, fortunately I did listen and identify an opportunity with a handful of early companies. And I did put a check in some really great companies that ended up becoming really big. But this was not like a systematic, thesis driven opportunity. It was more of just serendipity of kind of seeing the, using a basketball analogy. I was just kind of around the basket, and I picked up a rebound and just put it back in. It was pretty easy because, when you're around a bunch of stuff, you end up seeing really good opportunities. And so I think that the lesson here for founders listening is, if you're, in the ecosystem and you're, relatively, you're starting to get more connected and you're building something successful, you're probably surrounded by other people that are going to become incredibly successful entrepreneurs. And putting 10, 15K in some of their companies, if you can afford it, probably will pay off in the long run.
That's a great point. And yeah, it's interesting that you were also not very systematic in terms of having your own thesis, kind of just invest in these verticals. Of course, at that time, it's also related with the, let's say, the values of the founder that we have in front of us. And if we really believe in the vision and in the person, I think it's even more in the person than even in the vertical, right? So it's, if you come along with that person, if you believe that really that person can build something big that can add a lot of value to society. What has been some of kind of your motivation behind picking what were the founders that you wanted to invest in as an angel or not, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple really obvious ones. Like,
Yeah.
if I worked with someone, like I worked with a guy by the name of Lucas Vargas, who, ended up taking over as CEO for me when I became chairman. And just I'd worked with him for 7 or 8 years, right? So like those are the obvious ones where you're like, okay, this person is a force of nature. That whatever they're gonna do, like I'm in. And actually, I think that is a very good investment strategy. If there's people that you've had an opportunity to work with, or that you've worked very closely with, and you just know they're amazing, like, and they want, and they feel motivated to go start a company, and it's an intrinsic kind of conviction they have, then make a move like that you should support them early. And I prefer to be like the first check in those people, because I think that's where there's outsized value creation. Beyond that, I would say, if I could ask a founder like one question, I would just ask them why they're building what they're building, what their motivation for what they're building is. Because I think that will tell you so much. Because the reality is, it's so hard. If money is their main motivator, there's other easier ways to make money. And frankly, when it gets so hard, money is probably not going to be enough of a motivation for you to kind of push through the difficult moments. So therefore, understanding why they're starting the company. If someone's starting a health tech company because, their, family member suffered through, the terrible process of getting cancer, and then they got kind of dragged through the system, there's a really good chance that person is going to just keep going until they figure it out, right? Just because their motivation is intrinsically so pure. So that purity of motivation is something that I really look for. Other things that I look for, obviously, there's just certain signals, if they've worked at, certain companies, or they've been part of certain success, growth stories. There's plenty of different, when I say schools, I'm not talking about the education. I'm talking about the Nubanks, the Rapis, the Mercado Libres. Those are incredibly good schools because they just teach you a lot of things. So I think that those are all kind of things that I look at. And then sector-wise, I at one point, a mistake that I probably made was that I probably saw almost every single prop tech deal for like, several years, because I had built a reputation in prop tech as a founder. And then I made a couple of really good investments in prop tech. And I at some point I was like, one, there's like, you become less interested in what you've already done because you become jaded a little bit, like, this is like going to be really hard. And it's, and you, and then combining with that is that I remember questioning, I'm like, oh, am I over indexed in prop tech? And the answer in retrospect was no. It's a massive sector. I passed on a few businesses that I was just like, yeah, I've already made enough prop tech investments, and they turn out to be, incredible opportunities. And so I think that, like, if you have expertise in a vertical, then, you should leverage your expertise and, not shy away from it just because you're maybe a little bit, jaded by what you know is difficult.
Right. And this is something that is difficult also from a psychological perspective, is kind of not getting with that advice. I've tried that and it didn't work because, of course, at the time things were a little bit different. Your path is always different. I think in a certain way, the same happens to me in other ventures as advisor. I try to avoid saying that to new founders because we never know the context, and we have seen so many companies fail but the timing was not right, and there was other factors that were not that might not be a good let's say advice for founders who are trying to build or scale a venture. So there is here a lot of psychological traits. Kind of the question is if you agree or not, right?
Yeah, and it takes an outsider many times, right? When you come from inside an industry, you have a certain kind of like blind spot because you take for granted what exists. And so I think that, betting on outsiders, and also sometimes it requires a naivete that enables you to just go in and just do something that seems really difficult, right? So
exactly. I love it. I think that's one of the advantage of founders who are doing it for the first time. Is if I look back when I started Scaleup Valley, it was kind of that ignorance that allowed me to be here after 10 years. Helping with VC-backed companies, because if I knew the journey, I would never ever have started Scaleup Valley. So that's good to know. I'm talking about myself, about the ignorance, not about the other founders. But anyway, and typically, just to conclude, kind of this component of your experience as angel investor, would you say it would be a good time to start investing at a seed stage, at Series A stage? It depends on the founder. You were also talking about being careful to not become a distraction. At that time, you are also going through a lot of ups and downs, as we have been discussing with your journey with Viva Real. So there is so many crises to face, that it seems a little bit crazy to even taking calls with other founders and trying to help and invest checks on them. So what would you say if you would come back at Viva Real? At what stage would you start investing?
Yeah, I would say that once you've kind of nailed your business model and then you build a team, if you're at the stage where you've kind of nailed it and you're starting to scale the operation, and your business is like highly dependent on you in every aspect, you haven't really found product market fit and you haven't really built a strong team. So I would say that like, I would not spend a lot of time. Unless you're like independently wealthy and you just have, a lot of capital and you can afford, and you have a lot of resources in your company. You could consider still doing stuff when you're pre-product market fit. But I would say that probably something around like kind of, Series B, like once you're looking for some more, kind of gas to throw on the fire, and you're accelerating an existing model that really works and it's become more predictable. I think at that point, angel investing is good because you're actually gaining a ton of insight into innovative ideas, and you're talking with founders that are really thinking about things from a different lens. And I think that's going to enable you to, because one of the things that you do as a founder is that you find the recipe, it works, and it's good to have focus, but you don't want to have your head down so much to the point where you're not looking up and seeing what's out there, because that's when you become complacent and you think you've got it all figured out. And so I think that a healthy dose of paranoia, complemented by inspiration from other existing companies that are on their way up and doing some innovative things, I think is a good recipe for staying sharp.
Right. Great advice. Awesome. And let's go into your recent baby that is becoming already an adolescent, and it's growing, and young adult, and growing and growing. And it's great to see the progress and what you have built in such a short period of time. So please present to the community, especially for the ones who didn't have yet the opportunity to listen to your amazing content, of course, to the Latitud website, podcast, now the Vamos LATAM Summit, 21st of September, if I'm not wrong, in São Paulo. But anyway, let's start with the beginning. What is Latitud? What is your vision, mission for Latitud, and why did you start it?
Sure. I'll first start off with a little bit of the motivation and the kind of the rationale to start Latitud. It was kind of started more as an accident, because really just authentically, I gravitated towards founders and helping them. And it was the summer of 2020. I'm sure everyone listening knows kind of what was going on in 2020. I found myself.
Some forgot, Brian, maybe.
I was waiting for the antitrust to approve the sale of my company. And when I kind of, I felt a little bit helpless in that process, because you're kind of subject to this, government process. And so I'm just sitting here kind of in a waiting pattern. And in order to distract myself, I ended up reaching out to my network ended up taking 150 Zoom calls from early stage founders in Latin America, from Mexico down to Argentina and everywhere in between. And those calls, like, two things really struck me. The first was the caliber of, just talent and ambition was far greater than, my vintage when I started. But the second thing that I realized was that there was still an incredible gap in understanding some basic stuff that I took for granted, like how to raise a seed round or how to recruit, an initial team, and, how to manage stock options, things like that. And so in those conversations, I identified that this massive gap existed. And so I wanted to kind of do my part. I felt a bit of sense of responsibility to give back to the next generation of founders, considering that, so much was given to me. And so in these 150 Zoom calls, I just started listening to founders, and I started pulling in my network. And this led to September 2020. I ended up partnering with Gina Gotthilf, who ran growth at Duolingo, and Yuri Danilchenko, who was the CTO of a Kazakh-backed company that scaled in Brazil. And the three of us kind of put our heads together, and we started just being a resource for these early stage founders, hosting sessions on topics, pulling in our network to host other, sessions live for, 40 entrepreneurs in the first cohort. And it was so kind of astounding to see how much people appreciated the support. So this kind of looked a lot more like a nonprofit at that point, because we had zero business model. We ended up scaling up the cohort, building a team. I put in some money to kind of keep it going. And then we essentially evolved into a remote community that was, cohort based. Today, we've scaled up to about 1,400 founders that have gone through our 6 to 8 week programs, which kind of, are usually pre-product market fit companies. These companies have collectively in the last 18 months raised $500 million coming out of our programs. And so we did that initially. It was all free, equity free, everything. And then we realized we needed to kind of sustain ourselves. Otherwise, it would be something that I would just put money in every month and not have a business plan. And so we started, charging a moderate fee just to kind of pay the operations. So, we did that. And then two things happened. Two realizations became very clear. As we kind of helped all these founders, we realized that there was a lot of friction still. We could help with knowledge and advice. So we kind of decoupled capital from advice and network. And we helped them with the advice and network piece. But regardless, there was still a massive friction, even from those founders that were just starting their companies. One thing we realized, I had started Vivaral, and in starting Vivaral, I created a Delaware C Corp, which is kind of the advised structure, at least back in the day, from U.S. investors. But what U.S. investors didn't realize is that you would end up paying capital gains taxes upon an exit. And when I sold my company, earlier that year, we ended up paying over $100 million in capital gains taxes unnecessarily in the U.S. without one, client in the U.S. or team member in the U.S. And so that was a harsh, kind of reality that we learned quickly from experience. And so when I looked at the 90% of the venture-backed companies in Brazil that were coming through our cohort, we're looking to spin up Cayman holding companies, a Delaware LLC, and then a local operating company in Colombia. So all of the VC investors were kind of requiring that structure. But what I found, because I had spun up a few companies of my own as an early investor and advisor, and what I realized is that the legal bills for those companies was, north of $30,000, and they were taking 2 to sometimes 3 months to get these companies going. So as an entrepreneur, that really kind of, chapped my hide, so to speak, or, kind of annoyed me. And it was the inspiration for our first product that we built, which is called Latitud Go. Now, Latitud Go is an automated company formation product where, if you're starting a venture-backed company, starting in Brazil, but quickly expanding to the rest of Latin America, instead of, hiring a law firm in the US and then hiring a law firm in Cayman and then in Brazil, you basically just work with us. We, triangulate all 3 law firms, and we built an automated process to basically structure the company holding. And we do it 5 times less expensive. and we do it, faster than you would normally get with a law firm. And we do it with the exact same kind of structure that you would get if you hired a New York or a Silicon Valley law firm. And so that was our first product that we built. And so we realized that we want to build products, going back to the community. We had these cohorts, this became a really engaged community. You listen to the community kind of shares with you what the challenges are that you're facing. And then you can build software to reduce friction for those founders. So we have a whole roadmap of, very founder focused roadmap where we're trying to create super highways and, make it much more efficient and reduce friction for those early stage founders. So that's the second realization. And then the third realization is that we just started realizing that we can invest also. And that was an extension of my angel investing. And since then, I've kind of pulled the plug on my angel investing and we've launched a fund. The fund has 110 limited partners, all, either, founders, from the top tech companies, unicorn founders in LATAM, also coupled with GPs of the top global funds that are also LPs. And so we do pre-seed and seed checks. And so, there's 3 business units: education business, cohort-based education, combined with our software stack that is empowering the next generation of founders to, enable them to, build, reduce friction and build their companies. And then, the venture fund.
And kind of the events that you are preparing in next week already. It's incredible how time flies. And of course, this will be released maybe after the event. We are recording the episode on the 13th of September to give some context. This will be part of kind of your education business unit of coming or bringing the community together, right?
Yeah, actually, the way I look at Latitud is we have 3 business units. We have the cohort education business, we have the software stack, and then we have the venture fund. And it's all kind of, wrapped up in media assets. So the podcast that I have, the book that I wrote, Viva the Entrepreneur, which I put out before all of this, our blog, all the social media stuff that we do. All of that is, we look at that as like, everything kind of wrapped up in a media company. And I'm a big believer in the power of media. You've got a podcast, so you probably can relate. But it would probably fit more in the community, and education piece, because we think that, the media is, really an education kind of play. So the event that we launched, it's going to be in Sao Paulo. It's called the Vamos LATAM Summit. We already have 1,200 people registered, coming from all over, I think like 15 countries, mostly Brazil. And then we will host a similar event in March in Mexico City as well.
By the way, where you are based now, right? So you have been living in Colombia, Brazil, in the West Coast, in the US, and now Mexico.
I've been in Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico City, for almost 2 months now. And I just wanted to get more familiar with the kind of startup ecosystem here in Mexico. Also, make sure my kids learn some Spanish. And so we're spending a year here as I kind of go deeper into the Mexican ecosystem.
And that's really amazing, because then you have an insider perspective of the 2 largest markets in LATAM, with your experience with Viva Real in Brazil, and now living in Mexico and being able also to be closer to the community. Which sounds that as a founder, you keep going to where the company needs to go and expand, and also having your family on board to do those moves. Sounds fantastic. So maybe going into a personal component, how were you able to convince your wife to always go with you to all those challenges and visions that you fought for yourself?
I think that the agreement that we had early on was that as long as we had a main home that we could go back to, she would be willing to kind of jump on the journey with me. And so in this particular case, coming to Mexico was a lot easier than when I moved to Brazil, because, moving to Brazil in 2011, I didn't have the financial resources. I was kind of, living in an Airbnb that was not very nice and sleeping on my co-founder's couch for, a few months. And so that, I would say that was, but that was pre-kids. So that was something that we were able to kind of, manage, the two of us. There's some non-negotiables now that you have kids. You want to be a little more comfortable. Safety is a top priority, schools. And so I think that the main reason why my wife agreed to that is she knows the importance of, wanting our kids to speak Spanish. And so having that kind of cultural experience for a year and enabling our kids to be able to, that was probably the main benefit. And then there's some also benefits just being in Mexico and in Latin America in general that, that you don't really get in the US in terms of like, help around the house and things like that. So both of us were happy to, be able to, have some support there with, the kids and other things that, none of us loves doing laundry. So, that's something that, we've been able to have some great support that has enabled us to kind of focus on our careers right now and our kids rather than household stuff.
Right. It's a very important point. We don't discuss this a lot in podcasts. We always talk a lot about business, but that's definitely the personal side of the life of an entrepreneur. It's really, really important to have an amazing life partner that is aligned with our vision, and that, of course, we are able also to support them to be happy and to be able also to fulfill their dreams. So having an husband or a wife or a boyfriend or a girlfriend that supports, that's really super, super important. And we know that a lot of those entrepreneurs at a certain time need to travel or to go to another market. And of course, without the family, it will be even harder, let's say, or at least communication is super important, right?
No, it's fundamental. I've been married for 17 years now. So we've been able to work. And, I think that I remember, probably 10 or 12 years ago, there's a book by Brad Feld, which is called Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur. And I remember buying that, reading it myself, and then asking my wife to read it because, there are some things like, being an entrepreneur is a very kind of consuming, thing in your life. And it's something that, a lot of people look for kind of, work-life balance. And, in your early, kind of your 20s and your early 30s, it's really hard to, to figure that out. And not, let alone starting a family. Also, that was something that, we struggled to start a family, and I was starting a company and I was in another country. And so I think that I agree that those things aren't talked about as much, and they're so fundamental and so important because, your happiness is ultimately, what, you can be super successful and unhappy. You can have a lot of money in the bank and be super unhappy. And, I think that, that's not a way to live. And so figuring out how to balance that. And I would say that I'm not the master at this by any means. I think that I've gotten better as I've gotten older. But this is a constant struggle, I think, for entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. And I think other of the myths, and I see now founders being also happy to announce that they are having babies, is there was this kind of advice: don't try to have a baby and have a startup at the same time. And we are seeing several founders, including yourself at the time with Viva Real, that it's possible to lead a startup and at the same time having a family or raising the family and having more kids. How has been the experience? And I know that you have an amazing story, even with the support of Mona, she's with a nanny at the time. If you would like to share also a little bit more about that. I think even for the ones who are now starting their ventures or scaling their ventures and thinking it is the time, we are ready to be parents, but we might be afraid about what investors would think, if we are really committed with the venture or not. I think it would be nice to listen from you for the ones who are listening to us.
I think that, one realization I had is like a new dad start, running a company too, is that I realized this kind of created some more, I guess, sensitivity around the topic of like paternity leave, which, most companies, like childbearing and raising children oftentimes falls on the, in the the responsibility of a woman. And so if you think about entrepreneurship and you think about becoming a founder, that even, accentuates even more the difficulties of starting a company if you're a woman and then you're, at an age where you're going to have children. So I think that
good point.
There's I think some special attention that should be drawn to that because, I think that for women, imagine you're a female founder, and then you're also, I've invested in some, Emma Smith, who runs Heffa. I remember she had, a baby while she was running, and she obviously took a few months off, and it shouldn't be taboo, to be able to do that. Realistically, it's obviously hard, right? Like it's hard no matter what. And so, but I think it's manageable. And you mentioned, Monashees. For those that don't know, Monashees was, my Series A investor along with Kazek. And, they helped me with a ton of things. I'd mentioned Lucas Vargas, who ended up taking over as CEO. They helped recruit him, and, they helped with a handful of things. But the one of the things that actually moved the needle the most for me was like moving into a new country and then finding someone that could, support us in, as having a nanny. And that it was such a value kind of unlock for me because, I didn't want to be grinding all day, super tired, working my butt off, and, and then I'm not going to be present with my kids, and so figuring out the balance. And one thing that I decided early on when I had my son, this is in 2013, I made a commitment to myself that I would be home to sit down for dinner 4 nights a week. So, before that, I'd probably been staying out and, staying at the office till 9 o'clock because there's just an endless amount of things to do. And I think that these things are just life choices that you make, right? And I think that, there's so much pressure that you put on yourself as a founder that you kind of think you have to make decisions whether it's going to be, your family or your company. And I think that that's something that I maybe at some point early on, I before I had kids, I probably maybe neglected certain things because I was just working all the time, and that probably put, some strain on the relationship. But I think at some point you just have to make a decision about what you value and what kind of life you want to have. And so I think that that's something that just needs reflection. And then, life is about choices, right? You have to make choices in your life. You have to decide, is this going to be, and I remember identifying a few people that were role models to me in terms of CEOs, but they also had very unhappy personal lives. And that to me was a sign where it's I could project out in the future and be what do I want for myself? And there's other people that I saw were able to manage it. And so I tried to focus on asking them questions how did you manage this? How did you, at the end of the day, it's just about making sure you prioritize what you care about.
Yeah. Even in the other day, I was, of course, I shared that I've shared this on the podcast that I was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition who made my life difficult last year with strong fatigue. So I was not able even to have 1 or 2 calls a day. So I would have a call and go rest to have another call in the afternoon. And someone, of course, I shared this, and someone started sharing that they have a friend that was leading a venture-backed company who was diagnosed with cancer and needing to kind of scale a company, being diagnosed with cancer. And I said, wow, it's really, really amazing that sometimes it is possible first to have family, to have kids, to have your personal time, to have vacation, to be an entrepreneur, and of course to be able to survive an health condition and keep doing what you love. As you said, if we are surrounded with the right people, namely our co-founders, our teams, our investors, it definitely is possible to not, let's say, kill our personal lives to build the company. Also because we are also involved in the venture because we believe in the purpose and because we believe that it makes sense to do that and it will be a contribution to society. So amazing points and great stuff that we discussed spontaneously here in the podcast that I'm sure they will be useful for other founders and the ones who would like also to found their own ventures. And there is also another interesting story that I will even recommend people to listen to your episode 100 of your own Latitude podcast, which explains how to involve community in raising a $13 million seed round, where you have also the founders investing in Latitude and in the future of the ecosystem, in the future of other founders. I think that's an amazing and very inspiring story. But before going into the last segment, I would like to ask you what is coming next for Latitude. So what is your long-term vision and mid-term vision? What's next? What can we expect from Brian and your team?
Yeah, I'd say that, there's going to continue to be companies founded in Latin America over the next decade. And, this new software stack to empower founders in Latin America is needed to accelerate the trend. And so I feel really lucky that we've kind of stumbled on this setup of software, community, and fund. And it really results in this kind of perfect mix for a flywheel, which I think could create incredibly strong, defensible positioning for Latitude when it comes to starting a company and investing in Latin America. So, I think that over the next, couple of years, the way I look at Latin America, and this is crazy maybe for like more developed markets, like in the US or, in some places in Europe, where the idea of building startup infrastructure, potentially, banking services along a continuous education platform, it may seem unfocused from someone that's, not familiar with more underdeveloped markets. But when you look at these markets in, Latin America, you have an opportunity to implement a more vertical solution. And you need to do that in order to solve more meaningful problems. So going full stack allows you to serve better customers and build moats around your business. So yeah, we're very concentrated on the next, 5-10 years. We want to build the super highways for, tech startups in Latin America by helping world-class founders launch, raise capital, and find customers and attract talent. So the community is kind of the way we scale that. And we, layer on products that solve these major pain points in the founder's journey. And hopefully that unlocks some, growth and economic progress and social mobility in the region. So that's a quick kind of summary of how I see it. In terms of like what the most key things are is I want to get in the hands of every single venture-backed startup. I want to be the starting point for them in Latin America. And so you'll probably see an obsession of that over the next 2 to 3 years until we have, kind of significant market share. And then we will, continue to layer on additional products that reduce friction.
Love it. Clear and really the impact of just in 24 months or so of helping companies raising $500 million in capital. It's really incredible. Super well done. Should I have asked something that I didn't ask you, or any final message that you'd like to share with the community before we jump into the usual last segment of the show?
I would just say, as it relates to Latitude, like, founding a company is super hard. It's super lonely. It's, you kind of feel lost at sea sometimes. And so, I think that finding your community, your tribe of people that can, maybe you're one or two steps ahead of you is absolutely fundamental, because it enables you to kind of, see around the corner. And I'd say that was a turning point in my journey, is finding, a handful of people that, I could kind of depend on, that would, help create clarity for me and provide with, some emotional and, kind of support, not only, just support, but like, a shoulder to lean on, but also insight into what I was building. I think that all those things help you kind of create clarity as a founder. And so I would suggest everybody to find their kind of community that can help them. And it could just be a small mastermind group of 4 or 5 other entrepreneurs. We called it the Breakfast Club at when I was building my company. There was a handful of other founders that were, scale-up founders that we could kind of just lean on and share some of our challenges and experiences.
Love it. Great advice. Brian, let's go into the last segment of the show, where I ask you a quick question and you give me a quick answer. So if you'd have the opportunity to have a coffee with yourself at the beginning of Viva Real, what advice would you offer to your younger self?
It's an interesting thought that I have. I don't know if, I'm trying to process it and exactly how I would articulate it, but I think as an entrepreneur, and this is part of the secret of why you're able to like overcome incredible obstacles, because I think founders tend to like almost make the success of their company like a life and death scenario. And so I don't know if this advice is counterintuitive and maybe like, I don't think it negatively affects the success, but I would probably tell myself, to not take it so seriously, that, it's a long game, where certain times you'll chalk up an L, a loss, and you'll just think that like the world is collapsing. And the reality is that this is a 10 to 12 year kind of journey. And so sometimes there'll be one step, one step back, two steps forward, and if you can just realize that, in the scope of what you're building, that, a setback is not the end of the world. I think that I probably, and then there's part of me that's like, well, maybe that's, if I'm honest with myself, maybe that's the reason why I work so hard and I push through. So I don't know if, maybe it's like the position of privilege where I'm like kind of in a point where I had some degree of success and that I get to like think a little bit more long-term in how I'm operating. But I do think that, if you stay focused and, realize that you're playing a long game, you will, I think that your incremental, growth will happen, nevertheless the same, but you just won't have maybe such highs and lows, because, I think that as you get more mature and you get more experience, like you still have highs and lows. They're just, the swings are less dramatic and it's more of a consistent climb rather than a, like a falling off a cliff or a climbing Mount Everest.
Right. What are you the most proud of on your journey so far?
I think the thing that I'm most proud of is the time that I took to decide what I wanted to do next, to find a balance of kind of what I wanted to sink my teeth into in this next venture. It's easy to just like settle for something and just go build the next thing, but it really requires a lot of effort and time and processing to think about. I came across this framework which it's called Ikigai. It's a Japanese framework that refers to kind of reason for being or a sense of purpose. And it's a combination of what you love, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and also what you're good at. So those three things kind of wrap up, your passion, mission, vocation, and your profession. And so I think it's really hard to strike a balance of all those things. Like it's nearly impossible. And so I'm proud that I had the patience and the authenticity to pursue something that I feel like I could work on for easily a decade or longer. So that's the thing I'm most proud of. It's less of like an accomplishment and more of the, I think, self-knowledge to be able to put my energy in the thing that I think will have the greatest impact, and that I can have the longest sustainable focus, so that I can have an outcome that I want and enjoy the ride while I'm on it.
The long-term focus and the commitment for the next decade of your life to build something that matters. Worst advice ever received?
Probably the worst advice that I've heard is, as an early stage founder, to like project out 2 years and think, and then hire someone that you can grow into. I think that's bad advice, because when you're an early stage founder, you just need to get to the next stage. You need to stay alive. You need to be able to. So I think that like, hiring for the future maybe makes sense once you've kind of hit some scale and you kind of want to project out to where you're going to be. But I think it's very bad advice for a pre-product market fit company, because you're just going to have a disconnect. If you hire a super senior sales executive and you haven't found product market fit yet, chances are you're going to be underutilizing that resource, causing frustration. And so the opposite advice would be hire the people that you need right now to tackle the problems immediately in front of you.
Especially pre-product market fit. And now the resources that you would recommend, favorite book?
I don't know if it's my favorite book, but the book that actually had the biggest impact on me as an entrepreneur, I remember coming across the book by Chris Anderson called The Long Tail. And it my brain exploded when I understood that there was this concept of the long tail and how, you could, build a product or, it just made me realize why Amazon was so important and so powerful. And I think that probably shaped me the most as an entrepreneur, because it kind of created a clarity and an insight into my business where I was like, oh, if I aggregate every single piece of inventory, real estate wise, I'm going to, build this long tail of traffic through Google and other things. So I think that's the book that probably had the most impact on me. I am re-listening to a book that's not a business book, but I read the book Shantaram, which is a very long, 1,000-page book. And it's about an Australian convict, or he's actually, I think he's a New Zealand, convict. I can't remember, from Australia, New Zealand. And he ends up, escaping prison and then moving to India and recreating his life in India. And it's kind of a biographical story. And it's an amazing tale that is super entertaining. It's like a 50-hour Audible. So, I kind of pop it on once in a while and just, if I want to kind of zone out and not think about business, I listen to that.
Could you repeat the name of the book?
Shantaram.
Shantaram.
Yeah, I'll put it in the notes here.
Got it. Perfect. And favorite movie or series? Yeah.
I'm pretty boring, man. I literally don't watch much TV or movies that much. I have had a guilty pleasure of watching a show recently that, again, let me look. It's the Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Okay.
And it's a completely just ridiculous comedy. And I found that one thing that, I historically have not done is, I find myself on my phone or, reading a business book before I go to bed, and then it affects my sleep because it doesn't allow my brain to rest. So this show is just it's just absurdity to the max and fun and ridiculous. And so, it's kind of like The Office, but it takes place in a police station in Brooklyn. And so, I like the comedy and I've been I don't really watch any shows, but for some reason I just found this show on Netflix and I've been watching it when I want to kind of zone out and not be in work mode.
And finally, your favorite podcast?
My favorite podcast. I would say I have two favorite podcasts. So I'm sorry if I can't choose one. Again, I'm the plurality of business and then, outside of business. My favorite business podcast is Harry Stebbings, 20-minute VC. I think he does an amazing job, and it's just packed with content. And then I listen to the New York Times, The Daily, pretty regularly, and that's just kind of more current events, and just so that I'm at least kind of staying up with things that are happening in the world. So those are the podcasts that I probably listen to on a regular basis. I do like Joe Rogan too, and but so I cheated and I gave you three answers.
Well done, Brian. Perfect. Brian, it was such a pleasure to have you on the show. You are always welcome to come back to keep sharing your journey with Latitud and to discuss, of course, other topics that are important for founders. And thank you so much for making the time. It was really a pleasure.
Obrigado. A próxima vez vamos falar português quando estiver lá em Portugal e vamos bater papo já em pessoa. Então, obrigado pelo convite.
Obrigado, Brian, and vamos LATAM.
Vamos LATAM. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And
okay, bye-bye.